So our next speaker is a repeat offender for today. Please welcome back to the stage, Andrew Schauer.
I'm going to continue on the theme of uncertainty here and talk about an avalanche problem that we deal with quite regularly up in Girdwood, Alaska, where I work. And, you know, for those of you who thought it was a stretch to listen to me talk about avalanche problems in Montana, just buckle up because we're going to take a trip another 2,000 miles north and zoom in on a problem in Alaska. I want to start by thanking the two people that helped make this project happen. This was kind of the brainchild of Andy Modero, and he went through an incredible amount of effort to manually compile weather and avalanche records. He's spent an incredible amount of time just reading through all of our professional observations and putting the data in a format that's usable to run an analysis. And Olive Johnston-Bloom, who's in the room somewhere, was also a critical part of this, you know, from every step of the way, from where we're trying to plan how we're going to make the project happen to actually writing it in a way that is coherent and logical and high quality research, I think. So I'm going to address this right off the bat instead of at the end. But why are we going to spend a bunch of time here talking about forecasting for persistent avalanche problems on crusts, you know, coming from a climate where we can deal with maritime snowpack some years, intermountain snowpack most years, and some years we're looking at continental. You know, so in Alaska, it makes a lot of sense that we're thinking about this. Bringing that here to Colorado is a little bit funny, but there's really two very important things to keep in mind here. The first is that a lot of the properties that make this crust problem a challenge for us in Alaska have a lot of similarities with forecasting for persistent problems or deep persistent problems in general. So some of this stuff is probably going to sound very familiar for those of you that are dealing with, you know, depth hoar, buried facet layers on the regular. And then the other really important piece is considering this through the lens of climate change. So I'm guessing some of you in the room are familiar with this work. There's a group of researchers from Europe who presented a sort of state of the art of what the scientific community understands the climate impacts will be in the world of snow and avalanches. You know, I would say if you're going to take anything from my talk, it's that you should read this paper because it's really, really good, and it's like a baseline of what we know right now and a best guess of what we can expect. Among other things, one thing that we're already starting to see is high elevation terrain, starting to see more frequent rain on snow events. So areas that have never had to deal with crusts in the past are starting to encounter them more regularly, and I think that's important to keep in mind here in Colorado. You know, we're some of the highest elevation terrain in the country. So historically, rain on snow hasn't been a big issue, but that could change in the decades to come. So kind of keep those two things in mind while I'm talking about this. So I'll start off with a pretty common scenario that we deal with. Here's snow pit profiles from two different seasons. One was taken in, it was December of 2022 on top there, and the other was early January of 2021. There's two different crust layers that have a lot of similarities. So these crusts that we're talking about, it's not like the thin drizzle crust or like a brittle sun crust that you might think of. These are stout. So we're looking, you know, 10 to 20 centimeters thick. And often we'll see faceting. Once they're buried, we'll see facets develop above the crust, below the crust. We'll see these laminations of crusts and facets develop over time. And this is something, we looked at data from 9 seasons and found 10 significant crusts. So it's something that we see almost every single year. Some other key themes besides the structure is that we'll ultimately start seeing mixed test results. So this upper crust formed around Thanksgiving, this lower one formed early December. So at the time these pits were dug, they had been buried 3 or 4 weeks. And we generally transition from a time where for the first few storms, we'll get like really in your face, propagating test results with low tap numbers. But eventually that becomes more stubborn and we'll get mixed feedback. So in these 2 cases, we're seeing ECT-Ns in the low 20s, CTs in the mid 20s, some deep tap results. Likely in this similar time frame, we're probably digging other pits and getting occasional propagation, but not regular. So again, like kind of translating this to the lens of thinking about persistent problems, that should all sound pretty familiar. And then so ultimately we need to answer this question at some point: which one is a problem? Or maybe it would have been more accurate to say which one will remain a problem. Every year it seems like these tend to form early in the year for whatever reason. But it seems like during our meetings in January, we're having these heated discussions on whether, is this thing going to come back to bite us in 2 weeks? Or are we going to be looking at some questionable structure that will never ultimately produce a big avalanche cycle? As a public forecaster, it's an issue because, I need to figure out how urgent of a problem this is. How do I message for it? Does it need to remain problem 1 in our forecast for weeks? Or is it not going to do anything? We were faced with a similar structure last year. And during one of our meetings with all the avalanche professionals, so we have people from the railroad, DOT, the utility company, the ski resort guides. There's probably like 10 or 15 of us, and it came down to us just placing dollar bets on whether it's going to be a problem or not. And I think of everyone that put money on it, I think one person got it right. It didn't end up being a problem. In this case, this profile on the left did end up being a problem. So that snow pit was dug in December. About 4 weeks later, in early January, a skier triggered this avalanche. This is in a really high traffic area, Turning and Pass. And it was miraculously, everyone was fine. There were 15 people on this ridgeline when the avalanche was triggered. 2 people on the exact slope. So in the lower right, this is just a Google Earth image, but a skier triggered it from up here. He was taking pictures of his friends while they were skiing. And what happened was it's a big convex roll, and he was inching to the edge to get a better view. One skier was able to ski off the slab. The other one skied the other direction and ended up skiing into a bigger chunk of avalanche, basically, and he got carried, lost his ski, which another group in the area eventually found and returned to him. But the crazy thing about this was that it was triggered here, that fracture propagated all the way across this southern face, wrapped across this west face, which is, the slope angle there is mid-30s consistently. Some of these roly-polies roll over to like high 30s. Some of the flatter areas are in the low 30s. But that fracture wrapped right across. Big portions of that slope settled but didn't fully release. But so when we were up there the next day, you'd see these cracks that were like 6 inches wide that went all the way down. And then it propagated all the way around to the north face, and that's where this view is. The avalanche on the north face wiped out a skin track that a group had just put in. This avalanche on the south face wiped out a skin track that I had put in the day before. There were 15 people on the slope when it happened. Everyone ended up being fine. A lot of guesswork going into a problem with potentially serious consequences. So, our question is, how can we do better? So Andy started this by doing just a review of the existing literature. What are the best tools available for forecasting problems associated with crusts? Some of the themes that came up are looking at weather in the days and weeks following crust formation. Anecdotally, we've heard a lot of people say, hey, if a crust is buried before it has a chance to freeze, it can produce problems down the road. It seems like focusing on propagation potential and stability tests can be a useful tool, and also considering loading events, cumulative snow loads over several days, as opposed to just individual loading events. These can all be potentially helpful. So we highlighted that from previous work and then put it to the test at Turning It Past to try to see how effective these tools are and figure out why we still have such a hard time predicting these events. I think the coolest thing that came out of this was this idea of tracking cumulative precip on top of a crust starting with the day it formed. So if you look here, we're just looking at time on the x-axis, with 0 is the day the crust formed. And then we tracked it out to 100 days of just counting the total precip on top of it. And that's what we have on the y-axis. So this blue line that goes way up into the top, that was a big snow year. Where this orange line that hangs down at the bottom, we hardly got any snow. And these are color-coded into 2 specific groups, and the orange lines represent seasons where those crusts ended up producing big avalanches weeks to months after they were buried. The blue lines represent seasons where we might have seen some avalanche activity failing on the crust, like right after or as it's getting buried, but they didn't last in the long term. And a very clear trend shows up where the active seasons tend to have lower total precip, which should make sense. The other thing that came with this, if you do the same chart looking at average daily temperature, the other trend that pops up is that the active seasons also tend to be colder. So both of those are going to drive a bigger temperature gradient. You'd expect to see more fast-sitting and potentially more problematic snowpack. And then the inactive seasons tend to have higher precip totals, warmer temperatures. So looking at this, I think it'd be really nice to draw a line somewhere on this chart that we can use as sort of a threshold, where if we're tracking above that line, it's less concerning than if we're tracking below that line. And everyone's going to be psyched to hear that we get to talk about machine learning some more. But there is a tool to do that called support vector machines. We basically just treated each daily observation as its own observation, and then we use this tool to classify each day on whether it would be expected to belong to an active group or an inactive group. Just using cumulative precip on its own, we found the highest predictive accuracy was in the first 3 weeks after burial, and just that tool on its own was about 75% accurate on assigning these days to whether you should expect that crust to be a problem or not. Keep that number in mind as I keep going, 75%. Okay, so the next thing we looked at was this idea of crust phase, thinking about whether crust is buried wet or frozen, and if that should be a good indicator. And the results were not very satisfying. So we just split the group, looking at the active crusts, the inactive crusts, and all this bar plot is showing is out of our 4 active crusts, 2 of them were buried frozen and 2 of them were buried wet. Then if you look at the inactive group, 3 of them were buried frozen and 3 of them were buried wet. So it's about as effective as a coin toss if you just take it on its own. I think there's probably some more nuance that you could tease out of it, but this was just our quick glance at these indicators. And then what really starts to paint the picture of why these are challenging is when we started looking at stability test results. And what we did was we broke it up into sort of 4 different ways of lumping our stability test data together. If we're just focusing on our long beam results, so our extended column and our propagation SAW tests, They had about a 35% probability of detection, which is the number of times you can tell from your stability test that you're dealing with an unstable snowpack when you would eventually that day see collapsing or avalanche activity. 35% of the time. If we include CT tests, only considering the number of taps as a result, that number actually goes down, and we start our probability of detection is 32%. If we use CT tests, disregard the taps, and only include the fracture character that was recorded with the test, we see a slight improvement, 40%. So this kind of shows that trend that people had mentioned of how fracture character or propagation potential could potentially be useful, but we're still less effective than a coin toss. If you include all available data, ECT, PST, CT taps, fracture character, the best, and only use the most conservative results. So say you have 5 tests and 4 of them are showing stable results, one's unstable, and if you classify that as unstable, you're still 48% probability of detection. And then in that case, your false unstable rate goes way through the roof. So stability tests really struggle with this, and I think using that as a tool, that's kind of what we're trained to do, is part of why we have such a hard time forecasting for these. So what do you do with all this? Bad news first. Some of these things that anecdotally people have mentioned may be useful, turn out they're not quite as useful as we thought. So thinking about the phase of the crust at time of burial, stability tests. I didn't even get into the loading events, but those also have some serious challenges. The good news is we came out of it with some tools that, at least in our little neck of the woods, seem to work pretty well. So just by tracking cumulative SWE and average daily temperature, it's very easy data to gather. That can give you an idea in a general sense of whether you have a problem or you don't. And I think just with a little bit more work, we can just improve the way we're using tests to assess. I think there's like some nuance you can tease out of loading events, and also maybe a little bit more of exploration into that crust phase, because I think there may actually be something there, but just as a simple yes or no, it was clearly not that effective. If you're interested in reading more about either of these are the 2 papers we wrote for ISSW, and I don't know if we have time for questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
We have a couple minutes for questions. Any burning questions for Andrew? Carl and Ron?
Uh-oh.
Andrew,
We have a question over here too. We'll get after Carl if we can get a microphone there. Thanks.
Andrew, you were talking about improving the stability tests, and so I was just curious what ideas you had in terms of improving the test to help these probability of detections.
Yep, so I think it doesn't have anything to do with modifying the existing tests. I think one thing that can be really useful is, rather than just taking it at a glance, which this has been established in the past, is just looking at your trends to see relatively how sensitive your layer is. So if you're going from having a lot of propagating results to all of a sudden it's becoming more stubborn, maybe you get a loading event, you see a sudden change in that. That can be more useful. And then also one thing that I want to focus on in the future, after talking to some of the people that forecast in the Sierras, they mentioned that they've had luck using just deep taps and PSTs. And I think one of the things that came out of looking at our data set is that we're probably not doing enough PSTs. And we didn't even have enough to isolate them as their own group, but that's one potentially better practice that we can start working on.
Over here?
Yeah, Andrew, great talk. I like seeing machine learning and all this stuff as a nerd, fellow nerd. 2 questions. One, did you run your support vector machine with more than just SWE, and how are those results? And the second question is, do you have results for the false positive rates, stuff like that?
Yes, all that's in the paper. If you really want to dig into it, but for the support vector machines, we basically we ran one model using just SWE and one model using just temperature, and you could easily combine them to use both. You could make, really your model as complicated as you want. Part of the reason why we kept it the way we did was to try to make a simple, operational tool that we could use. And if your model gets so complicated that you can't really understand what's going on, even if you're at 99% predictive accuracy, it's going to be hard to use. So that's why we kept them pretty simple. And then in terms of the other stability test statistics, we also calculated the false alarm ratio and probability of false detection for each of the tests. And those are all in part 2 there.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew.